This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a professor of sociology at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, whose main interest is the sociology of knowledge in Israel, how Israelis formulate conceptions about themselves and their existence. He is the author of a recently published book entitled The Return of Martin Buber, National and Social Thought in Israel from Buber to the Neo-Buberians, that has come out only in Hebrew, sadly. He is also a personal hero of mine. His works featured prominently in my master's thesis, so it is a tremendous pleasure to have him here in the studio. Professor Uri Ram, hello, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you.
So Martin Buber, the early to mid-20th century philosopher, Jewish theologian and political thinker, is mainly remembered for these very reasons: his contribution to Jewish thought and his pacifism and binationalism that were really cutting edge for his time, 1940s Palestine. But your book sheds light on a forgotten achievement of his, one of many, that is that he was the first head of the first department of sociology in Israel at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem as of 1947. So what can you tell us about Martin Buber, the sociologist, and how did his sociological ideas differ from his other fields of interest that he is better remembered for?
Unlike many writings about Buber in general and in Israel, I focus, as you said, about his contribution and changing status in the discipline of sociology and in social thought in Israel more generally. And I would say I followed his changing fate in the discourse, from being a hero of the communitarian left in the Yishuv era, in the pre-state era, to being, in fact, excluded from the sociological discourse between the 1950s and the 1970s or 80s, the era of the state, the Ben-Gurion era, and finally, I would say, his recent reappearance on the stage as a hero of the postmodern and post-colonial left in Israel today. So I followed these three different...
So what were his sociological ideas, and why were they incompatible with the state of Israel in the 1950s to the 1980s?
Right. The 1950s is a time of transition in Israeli history and in Israeli social thought, and therefore also in Israeli sociology, transition from German orientation to American orientation. Personally, this transition was symbolized by the transformation of the chairmanship of the Department of Sociology in the Jerusalem, in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, from Martin Buber to his pupil, his student, who was very young then, 26 years old, Shmuel Noach Eisenstadt. And this transition signifies the paradigmatic transition from German orientation to American orientation, which means, in terms of the content that you ask about, a transition from sociology, which is basically anti-modern or very anxious about modernity, alienation, fragmentation, and so on and so forth, and which regards the, I would say, old times community, especially agrarian community, of equal partners as an ideal, as a model ideal type of society. This is called in German the Gemeinschaft.
So for Buber, the modernity was actually destructive to the ideal social structure?
Right. He was in accord on this anti-modern and anti-liberal an anti-Western perspective with the romantic intellectuals of Germany at the turn of the centuries, the 19th and 20th centuries. There was a special German antipathy, I would say, towards the West, towards Britain, France, and the United States in particular, and towards the Western civilization, which they thought is fabricated and alienated and so on. And Buber was one of those people who had this, who shared this attitude.
It was also a very Jewish idea, wasn't it, about the organic nature of the Jewish community?
Well, there is something Jewish about it in a way, but what is Jewish is a matter of interpretation. And indeed, Buber interpreted Judaism to be identified with the Gemeinschaft community, as it was called in German sociology. Now, Eisenstadt represents the time of the state. The state becomes the most important organ of social life. It is a centralized, it is a hierarchical organization, which in fact reorganizes society, rebuilds military, industry, modern economy, administration, and so on. And on top of it stood, of course, the figure of Ben-Gurion, who combined this nation-building project to the biblical terms of the ancient Hebrews who conquered Canaan and established the David kingdomship and so on and so forth. But this was a different interpretation of Zionism, which connected it to the nation state as organization. And there was, in fact, a whole state worship under Ben-Gurion primership. And Buber did not share this kind of orientation. And there was a need, in fact, to a new type of sociology, to a new paradigm, which Eisenstadt brought with him, and which was American, in fact. And it should not surprise us that there was this transformation from German to American paradigm, because we are in the post-World War II era with all the destruction the German civilization brought upon humanity and in particular upon the Jews. So there was a search for a new type of sociology which would in fact adopt and would bless the type of liberal democracy, capitalist liberal democracy that the United States in fact spread all over the world as far as it could in this period.
So is it a more civic notion of society that Eisenstadt brought to the table?
It's a more organized view of society. Society looked upon as an organization, as an institution, which has to function very well and to include different types of institutions and organizations and sub-identities and so on, and to reorganize them and reintegrate them in a functioning system. This was the new view which was brought from America and which was, of course, influenced by the sociology of Talcott Parsons and the paradigm of modernization, which was then in fashion. Mm-hmm. So Eisenstadt brought it to Israel, and it meant, in fact, excluding the type of sociology that Buber signified with his adoration of the old-type community. This was the time of the organized society, which is called Gesellschaft in the sociological jargon.
Mm-hmm. Which is society in German, essentially.
It's a society, and it is put in contrast to community, which is the Gemeinschaft, the old-type
this sort
Gemeinschaft.
of transition is something that we've witnessed in Israel really across the board in those years. This, first of all, a modern leap, if you will, and also a greater orientation towards the US and Western Europe.
Exactly, and I'm interested in showing how general transformations in the social structure and in the social culture and in political orientations, even internationally, how do all these changes bring also radical transformation in the paradigms that sociology operate with.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, 30-odd years later, Buber's ideas started to re-emerge. How so, and by whom? Are there any Buberian sociologists currently operating in Israeli academia?
I call this phenomenon Neo-Buberianism, and it means the rise of the figure of Buber as a new model, a new figure model for the third or fourth generation of sociologists. The first generation of Israeli sociology, the predecessors were people like Buber and Arthur Rupin and others before the state era. Then there is the second generation, which is headed by Eisenstadt and which led the discipline and social conceptualization in general in Israel between the 50s and the 1970s. Then comes a different generation of critical sociologists in the 70s and 80s. And then finally in the 1990s and onwards came a fourth phase in the development of sociology, which is associated more largely intellectually with postmodernity and post-colonialism. And this generation of sociologists who are practicing sociology at the present, when we are talking
in 2016,
are many of them are Neo-Buberians in different ways. That is to say, they rebel against modernity, against liberalism, against science, and readopt some of the communitarian, spiritual heritage of Martin Buber.
Mm-hmm. But to you, as a sociologist of knowledge, you are interested also in how these ideas are perceived in the general public, the wider audience, as it were. And these Buberian ideas of a community that has some pre-modern roots and has been to an extent blemished by modernity is something that is also very characteristic of the current public discourse in Israel, especially the rise of the nationalist right.
Exactly, and this is why I'm worried, because there is a strange confusion that emerges here between left-wing positions and right-wing assumptions. And Buber is a very useful pipe for this type of confusion. And
yeah, because on the surface it doesn't make sense that Buber himself had all these ideas, yet was very left-wing in today's terms. He was for binationalism in Palestine together with the Palestinian Arabs. He was a pacifist. It doesn't quite square with the way his ideas could be and are interpreted today.
Well, this is exactly the point that I'm trying to articulate in my book, and it is a bit difficult to understand, I'm afraid. This kind of strange combination, really, peculiar combination of some kind of humanistic politics, which Buber certainly exercised, and I must emphasize this. I'm not taking from him the credit that he deserves, but with that, his deep assumption, I would say his intellectual infrastructure is deeply immersed in extreme right-wing frames of mind.
That go back to Germany of the 19th century?
That go back to folkish perspective about the nation as a spiritual unity which exists beyond history and beyond the individuals that compose it. This is an attitude which is very anti-liberal and anti-modern and anti-democratic. And people who adopt his position today, because of the crisis of the left in Israel, because the left in Israel lost all of its political positions, in fact, and is in bankruptcy, they are looking desperately for solutions, and they adhere to Buber in this regard, but they don't see a level underneath his humanistic politics that there is this kind of folkish nationalist, ultra-nationalist, religious nationalist politics. In fact, his politics is very like the one of Rabbi Kook, who is the spiritual figure adored by Gush Emunim and the settlers in the occupied territories and the religious right wing in general, which put the supposed eternity of the covenant between the people of Israel, the land of Israel, and the God of Israel in the center of their life beliefs.
And Buber was the same. He
and
also believed
Buber is very close to this position. This is what I'm
so in
exposing in my book about Buber, which is not very well known until this point.
So in a sense, Buber was the odd one out here, because he took these ideas that were very nationalistic and anti-humanistic and gave them a humanistic turn. How did he do that? What was really the logical process that led him to take these ideas from one extreme to the other?
Well, it's a kind of rhetoric which I'm afraid, the humanistic rhetoric, I'm afraid is a shallow cover over the deeper beliefs that I indicate. And what I'm afraid is that people from the left, from the radical left, more even than from the left in general, people from the radical left, people who are looking for a different type of Israeli society, and rightly so, for a more just, more equal Israeli society which respects the civil rights and human rights of all people under its control or under its sovereignty. All these people are adopting an approach which combines right-wing elements with their own small-wing elements in a way which might lead them without their own recognition, without their own consent, to identify with religious ethnic positions that are spreading now in Israel.
So basically these people are opening the door to their political enemies, as it were, and providing them...
Exactly. You put it better than I could.
All right. And on this rather pessimistic note, even though there's a lot to be learned and taken from Buber's thought, we'll wrap up. Professor Uri Ram, Professor of Sociology at Ben-Gurion University, and the author of several books, including most recently The Return of Martin Buber, a national and social thought in Israel from Buber to the Neo-Buberians. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, the sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Also, check out our new website, telavivreview.org, and like us on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter at Gilad_Halpern. I tweet mainly about the review, and don't hesitate to get in touch with your comments and suggestions. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.
שוב אני מוצץ גבעול, מתחת גשר מת לנפול, כשמעלי העגלות בתנועה מתמדת. שוב אני מתחיל לשאול, מה לרצות, מה לאכול, כשהנמלה העניינית אותי מודדת.